"Here it is," said the third voice, and the owner of it held the lantern up and revealed the face of young Dr. Robinson. Potter and Injun Joe were carrying a hand barrow with a rope and a couple of shovels on it. They cast down their load and began to open the grave. The doctor said in a low voice, "Hurry, men. The moon might come out any moment." They growled in response and went on digging. For some time there was no noise but the grating sounds of the spades discharging their freight of mold and gravel. Finally, a spade struck upon the coffin with a dull, woody accent, and within another minute or two the men had hoisted it out on the ground. They pried off the lid with their shovels, got out the body, and dumped it rudely on the ground. The barrow was got ready and the corpse was bound to it with a rope. Potter took out a large spring knife and cut off the dangling end of the rope and then said, "Now the cussed thing's ready, Sawbones. You'll just out with another 5 or here she stays." Injun Joe said, "That's the talk." The doctor said, "Look here, what does this mean? You required your pay in advance and I paid you." Injun Joe approached him and said, "Yeah, and you done more than that. 5 years ago you drove me away from your father's kitchen one night when I come to ask for something to eat, and you said I wasn't there for any good. And when I swore I'd get even with you if it took 100 years, your father had me jailed for a vagrant you think I'd forget." He was threatening the doctor with his fist in his face by this time. The doctor struck out suddenly and stretched the ruffian on the ground. Potter dropped his knife and exclaimed, "Here, now, hey, you don't hit my pard." The next moment he had grappled with the doctor and the two were struggling with might and main. Injun Joe sprang to his feet, his eyes flaming with passion, snatched up Potter's knife, and went creeping cat-like and stooping round and round the combatants, seeking an opportunity. All at once, the doctor flung himself free, seized the heavy headboard of William's grave, and felled Potter to the earth with it. And in the same instant, the half-breed saw his chance and drove the knife to the hilt in the young man's breast. He reeled and fell partly upon Potter, flooding him with his blood, and in the same moment the clouds blotted out the dreadful spectacle, and the two frightened boys went speeding away in the dark. Presently, when the moon emerged again, Injun Joe was standing over the two forms, contemplating them. The doctor murmured inarticulately, gave a long gasp or two, and was still. The half-breed muttered, "That score is settled, damn you." The two boys flew on and on toward the village, speechless with horror. They glanced backward over their shoulders from time to time apprehensively, as if they feared they might be followed. Every stump that started up in their path seemed a man and an enemy, and made them catch their breath. And as they sped by some outlying cottages that lay near the village, the barking of the aroused watchdog seemed to give wings to their feet. Tom whispered in short catches between breaths, "If we can only get to the old tannery before we break down, I can't stand it much longer." Huckleberry's hard pantings were his only reply. They gained steadily on it, and at last, breast to breast, they burst through the open door and fell, grateful and exhausted, in the sheltering shadows beyond. By and by, their pulses slowed down, and Tom whispered, "Huck, what do you reckon will come of this? If Dr. Robinson dies, I reckon hanging will come of it." Tom thought for a while, and then he said, "Well, who'll tell? We? What are you talking about? Suppose something happened and Injun Joe didn't hang. Why, he'd kill us sometime or other, that's for dead sure." "That's just what I was thinking to myself, Huck. If anybody tells, let Muff Potter do it, if he's fool enough. He's generally drunk enough." Tom said nothing, went on thinking. Presently he whispered, "Huck, Muff Potter don't know it. How can he tell?" "What's the reason he don't know?" "Because he'd just got that whack when Injun Joe done it." "By hokey, that's so, Tom." After another reflective silence, Tom said, "Hucky, you sure you can keep mum?" "Tom, we gotta keep mum. You know that. Now look here, Tom. Let's take and swear to one another. That's what we gotta do. Swear to keep mum. There ought to be writing about a big thing like this, and blood." Tom's whole being applauded this idea. It was deep and dark and awful. He picked up a clean pine shingle that lay in the moonlight, took a little fragment of red keel out of his pocket, got the moon on his work, and painfully scrawled out these lines. "Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer swears that they will keep mum about this, and they wish they may drop dead in their tracks if they ever tell and rot." Each boy pricked the ball of his thumb and squeezed out a drop of blood. Tom managed to sign his initials, then he showed Huckleberry how to make an H and an F, and the oath was complete. Then they separated, cogitating. When Tom crept in at his bedroom window, the night was almost spent. After breakfast, his aunt took him aside, and Tom almost brightened in the hope that he was going to be flogged, but it was not so. His aunt wept over him and asked him how he could go and break her old heart so, and finally told him to go on and ruin himself and bring her gray hairs with sorrow to the grave, for it was no use for her to try any more. This was worse than 1,000 whippings, and Tom's heart was sorer now than his body. He moped his way to school, gloomy and sad, with the air of one whose heart was busy and heavy with woes and wholly dead to trifles. Close upon the hour of noon, the whole village was suddenly electrified with the ghastly news. A gory knife had been found close to the murdered man, and it had been recognized by somebody as belonging to Muff Potter, so the story ran. And it was said that a belated citizen had come upon Potter washing himself in the branch about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and that Potter had at once sneaked off. Suspicious circumstances, especially the washing, which was not a habit with Potter. All the town drifted toward the graveyard. Tom's heartbreak vanished as he joined the procession, not because he would not 1,000 times rather go anywhere else, but because an awful, unaccountable fascination drew him on. Arrived at the dreadful place, he wormed his small body through the crowd and saw the dismal spectacle. Somebody pinched his arm. He turned, and his eyes met Huckleberry's. Then they both looked elsewhere at once and wondered if anybody had noticed anything in their mutual glance. But everybody was talking and intent upon the grisly spectacle before them. "Poor fellow. This ought to be a lesson to grave robbers. Muff Potter'll hang for this if they catch him." This was the drift of remark, and the minister said, "It was judgment. His hand is here." Now Tom shivered from head to heel, for his eye fell upon the stolid face of Injun Joe. At this moment the crowd began to sway and struggle, and 20 voices shouted, It's him, coming himself. Who? Muff Potter." The crowd fell apart now, and the sheriff came through, ostentatiously leading Potter by the arm. Potter sobbed, "I didn't do it, friends, upon my word of honor. I never done it." "Who's accused you?" shouted a voice. This shot seemed to carry home. Potter lifted his face and looked around him with a pathetic hopelessness in his eyes. He saw Injun Joe, and he exclaimed, "Oh, Injun Joe, you promised me you'd never—" The sheriff said, "Is that your knife?" And he thrust it before him. Potter would have fallen if they had not caught him and eased him to the ground. Then he said, "Something told me if I didn't come back and get—" He shuddered and then waved his nerveless hand with a vanquished gesture and said, "Tell him, Joe, tell him. It ain't any use anymore." Then Huckleberry and Tom stood dumb and staring, and heard the stony-hearted liar reel off his serene statement, they expecting every moment that the clear sky would deliver God's lightning upon his head, and wondering to see how long the stroke was delayed. Somebody said, "Why didn't you leave? What'd you want to come here for?" Potter moaned, I couldn't help it. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't seem to come anywhere but here." And he fell to sobbing again. Injun Joe repeated his statement just as calmly a few minutes afterward on the inquest under oath. And the boys, seeing that the lightning was still withheld, were confirmed in their belief that Joe had sold himself to the devil. Tom's fearful secret and gnawing conscience disturbed his sleep for a whole week after this. Then Tom's mind drifted away from its secret troubles, finding a new and weighty matter to interest itself about. Becky Thatcher had stopped coming to school. He began to find himself hanging around her father's house nights and feeling very miserable. She was ill. What if she should die? There was distraction in the thought. The charm of life was gone. There was nothing but dreariness left. Tom reached school ahead of time. It was noticed that this strange thing had been occurring every day lately. And now, as usual of late, he hung about the gate of the schoolyard instead of playing with his comrades. Tom watched and watched, hoping whenever a frisking frock came in sight, and hating the owner of it as soon as he saw she was not the right one. Then, one more frock passed at the gate, and Tom's heart gave a great bound. The next instant he was going on like an Indian, yelling, laughing, throwing handsprings, standing on his head, doing all the heroic things he could conceive of, and keeping a furtive eye out to see if Becky Thatcher was noticing. But she seemed to be unconscious of it all. She never looked. Could it be possible that she was not aware that he was there? He carried his exploits to her immediate vicinity, came war-whooping around, and fell sprawling himself under Becky's nose, almost upsetting her. And then she turned, with her nose in the air, and he heard her say, "Phew, some people think they're smart, always showing off." Tom's cheeks burned. He gathered himself, sneaked off, crushed and crestfallen. Tom's mind was made up now. He was a forsaken, friendless boy, he said. Nobody loved him. When they found out what they had driven him to, perhaps they would be sorry. He had tried to do right and get along, but they would not let him. Since nothing would do them but to be rid of him, let it be so. And let them blame him for the consequences. Why shouldn't they? Yes, they had forced him to it at last. He would live a life of crime. There was no choice. By this time he was far down Meadow Lane, and the bell for school to take up tinkled faintly upon his ear. He sobbed now, to think he should never hear that old familiar sound anymore. It was very hard, but it was forced on him. Since he was driven out into the cold world, he must. But he forgave them. Just at this point, he met his soul's sworn comrade, Joe Harper, hard-eyed and with evidently a great and dismal purpose in his heart. Plainly, here were two souls with but a single thought. Tom began to blubber out something about a resolution to escape from hard usage and lack of sympathy at home by roaming abroad into the great world never to return, and ended by hoping that Joe Harper would not forget him. But it transpired that this was a request which Joe had just been going to make of Tom, and he had come to hunt him up for that purpose. His mother had whipped him for drinking some cream which he had never tasted and knew nothing about. It was plain that she was tired of him and wished him to go. As the two boys walked sorrowing along, they made a compact to stand by each other and be brothers and never separate till death relieved them of their troubles. Then they began to lay their plans. 3 miles below St. Petersburg, at a point where the Mississippi River was a trifle over a mile wide, there was a long, narrow, wooded island with a shallow bar at the end of it, and this offered well as a rendezvous. It was not inhabited. It lay far over toward the farther shore, abreast a dense and almost wholly unpeopled forest. So, Jackson's Island was chosen. Then they hunted up Huckleberry Finn, who joined them promptly. They agreed to meet at a lonely spot on the riverbank 2 miles above the village at their favorite hour, midnight. There was a small log raft there which they meant to capture. About midnight, Tom arrived with a boiled ham and a few trifles, and stopped in a dense undergrowth on a small bluff overlooking the meeting place. It was starlight and very still, and then a guarded voice said, "Who goes there?" "Tom Sawyer, the Black Avenger of the Spanish Main." "Name your names." Huck Finn, the Red-Handed, and Joe Harper, the Terror of the Seas. Tom had furnished these titles from his favorite literature. "'Tis give the countersign." Two hoarse whispers delivered the same awful words simultaneously to the brooding night. Blood. The Terror of the Seas had brought a side of bacon, and Finn the Red-Handed had stolen a skillet and a quantity of half-cured leaf tobacco. They shoved off presently, Tom in command, Huck at the after-oar, and Joe at the forward. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the raft grounded on a bar 200 yards above the head of the island, and they waded back and forth until they had landed their freight. They built a fire against the side of a great log, 20 or 30 steps within the somber depths of the forest, and then cooked up some bacon in the frying pan for supper, and used up half the corn pone stock they had brought. When the last crisp slice of bacon was gone and the last allowance of corn pone devoured, the boys stretched themselves out on the grass filled with contentment. And Joe said, "What would the boys say if they could see us?" Tom agreed. "Well, they'd just die to be here, hey, Hucky?" Huckleberry replied, "I reckon so. Anyways, I'm suited. I don't want nothing better than this." Tom said, "Yeah, well, it's just the life for me. You don't have to get up mornings, you don't have to go to school and wash and all that blame foolishness." Gradually, their talk died out, and drowsiness began to steal upon the eyelids of the little waifs. The pipe dropped from the fingers of the Red-Handed, and he slept the sleep of the conscience-free and the weary. The Terror of the Seas and the Black Avenger of the Spanish Main had more difficulty in getting to sleep. They said their prayers inwardly and lying down, since there was nobody there with authority to make them kneel and recite aloud. Then at once they reached and hovered upon the imminent verge of sleep. But an intruder came, now, that would not down. It was conscience. They began to feel a vague fear that they had been doing wrong to run away. And next they thought of the stolen meat. And then the real torture came. They tried to argue it away by reminding conscience that they had purloined sweetmeats and apples scores of times. But conscience was not to be appeased by such thin plausibilities. It seemed to them in the end that there was no getting around the stubborn fact that taking sweetmeats was only hooking, while taking bacon and hams and such valuables was plain, simple stealing. And there was a command against that in the Bible. So they inwardly resolved that so long as they remained in the business, their piracy should not again be sullied with the crime of stealing. A truce, and these curiously inconsistent pirates fell peacefully to sleep. When Tom awoke in the morning, he stirred up the other pirates, and they all clattered away with a shout, and in a minute or two were stripped and chasing after and tumbling over each other in the shallow, limpid water of the white sandbar. A vagrant current or slight rise in the river had carried off their raft, but this only gratified them, since its going was something like burning the bridge between them and civilization. They came back to camp wonderfully refreshed, glad-hearted, and ravenous. And soon they had the campfire blazing up again. While Joe was slicing bacon for breakfast, Tom and Huck stepped to a promising nook in the riverbank and threw in their lines. Almost immediately they had their reward. Joe had not had time to get impatient before they were back again with some handsome bass, a couple of sun perch, and a small catfish. Provisions enough for quite a family. They lay around in the shade after breakfast while Huck had a smoke and then went off through the woods on an exploring expedition. They took a swim about every hour, so it was close upon the middle of the afternoon when they got back to camp. They were too hungry to stop to fish, but they fared sumptuously on cold ham, and then threw themselves down in the shade to talk. But the talk soon began to drag, and then died. A sort of undefined longing crept upon them. This took dim shape presently. It was budding homesickness. Even Finn the Red-Handed was dreaming of his doorsteps and empty hogsheads. But they were all ashamed of their weakness, and none was brave enough to speak his thoughts. For some time now the boys had been conscious of a peculiar sound in the distance. But now this mysterious sound became more pronounced and forced a recognition. "What is it?" exclaimed Joe under his breath. "I wonder," said Tom in a whisper. They sprang to their feet and hurried to the shore. They parted the bushes on the bank and peered out over the water. The little steam ferry boat was about a mile below the village, drifting with the current. Her broad deck seemed crowded with people. Tom exclaimed, "I know now. Somebody's drowned." Huck said, "That's it. They done that last summer when Bill Turner got drowned. They shoot a cannon over the water. That makes him come up to the top." Joe said, "By jings, I wish I was over there now." Huck said, "I do too. I'd give heaps to know who it is." Presently, a revealing thought flashed through Tom's mind, and he exclaimed, "Boys, I know who's drowned. It's us." They felt like heroes in an instant. Here was a gorgeous triumph. They were missed, they were mourned, hearts were all breaking on their account, tears were being shed, and best of all, the departed were the talk of the whole town, and the envy of all the boys, as far as this dazzling notoriety was concerned. As twilight drew on, the ferry boat went back to her accustomed business, and the skiffs disappeared. The pirates returned to camp. They were jubilant with vanity over their new grandeur and the illustrious trouble they were making. But when the shadows of the night closed in on them, they gradually ceased to talk and sat gazing into the fire with their minds evidently wandering elsewhere. The excitement now, and Tom and Joe could not keep back the thoughts of certain persons at home who were not enjoying this fine frolic as much as they were. As the night deepened, Huck began to nod and presently to snore. Joe followed next. Tom lay upon his elbows motionless for some time, watching the two intently. At last he got up cautiously. A few minutes later, Tom was in the shoal water of the bar, wading toward the Illinois shore. Before the depth reached his middle, he was halfway over. The current would permit no more wading now, so he struck out confidently to swim the remaining 100 yards. He reached the shore finally and drifted along till he found a low place and drew himself out, landing 50 yards downstream out of danger of possible stragglers. He flew along unfrequented alleys and shortly found himself at his aunt's back fence. He climbed over and looked in at the sitting room window, for a light was burning there. There sat Aunt Polly and Joe Harper's mother talking. They were by the bed, and the bed was between them and the door. Tom went to the door and began softly to lift the latch. Then he pressed gently, and the door yielded a crack. He continued pushing cautiously until he judged he might squeeze through on his knees. Aunt Polly said, "Well, what makes the candle blow so?" Tom hurried up. "Why, that door is open, I believe." "Well, of course it is. No end of strange things now." Tom disappeared under the bed just in time. Aunt Polly said, "But as I was saying, he weren't bad, so to say, only mischievous. I mean, he weren't any more responsible than a colt. He never meant any harm." And she began to cry. So it was with my Joe, always full of his devilment, and laws bless me to think that I went and whipped him for taking that cream, never once recollecting that I'd throwed it out myself 'cause it was sour. And Mrs. Harper sobbed as if her heart would break. Tom was snuffling now himself, more in pity of himself than anybody else. He went on listening and gathered by odds and ends that it was conjectured at first that the boys had got drowned while taking a swim. Then the small raft had been missed, but toward noon the raft had been found, lodged against the Missouri shore some 5 or 6 miles below the village. And then hope perished. They must be drowned, else hunger would have driven them home by nightfall, if not sooner. If the bodies continued missing till Sunday, all hope would be given over, and the funerals would be preached on that morning. Tom shuddered. Mrs. Harper gave a sobbing good night and turned to go. Then, with a mutual impulse, the two bereaved women flung themselves into each other's arms, had a good consoling cry, and then parted. Aunt Polly knelt down and prayed for Tom so touchingly, so appealingly, and with such measureless love in her words that he was weltering in tears long before she was through. At last she was still only moaning a little in her sleep, and now the boy stole out, rose gradually from the bedside and stood regarding her. His heart was full of pity for her. Then he bent over and kissed the faded lips, and straightway made his stealthy exit, latching the door behind him. He threaded his way back to the ferry landing, found nobody at large there, and untied the skiff at the stern, slipped into it, and was soon rowing cautiously upstream. He hit the landing on the other side neatly, stepped ashore, and entered the woods. He rested until the sun was well up and gilding the great river with its splendor. Before he reached the threshold of the camp, he heard Joe say, "No, Tom is true blue, Huck, and he'll come back. I mean, he won't desert, but if he ain't back here to breakfast, well then." "Which he is," exclaimed Tom with fine dramatic effect, stepping grandly into camp. A sumptuous breakfast of bacon and fish was shortly provided, and as the boys set to work upon it, Tom recounted and adorned his adventures. After breakfast, they went whooping and prancing out on the bar and chased each other round and round, shedding clothes as they went until they were naked, but gradually wandered apart, dropped into the dumps, and fell to gazing longingly across the wide river where the village lay drowsing in the sun. Joe's spirits had gone down almost beyond resurrection. He was so homesick that he could hardly endure the misery of it. Huck was melancholy too. Tom was downhearted, but tried hard not to show it. He had a secret which he was not ready to tell yet. But if this mutinous depression was not broken up soon, he would have to bring it out. Joe sat poking up the sand with a stick and looking very gloomy. Finally he said, Boys, let's give it up. I want to go home. It's so lonesome." "But Joe, there ain't another such swimming place anywhere." "Well, swimming's no good. I don't seem to care for it somehow when there ain't nobody to say I shan't go in. I mean to go home." Tom said, "Oh, shucks, baby, you want to see your mother, I reckon." "Yes, I do want to see my mother. And you would too if you had one. I ain't any more baby than you are." And Joe snuffled a little. "Well, we'll let the crybaby go home to his mother, won't we, Huck? But you like it here, don't you, Huck? And we'll stay, won't we?" "I want to go too, Tom. It's getting so lonesome. And now it'll be worse. Let's us go too, Tom." "I won't. You can all go if you want to. I mean to stay." The boys started away, and Tom stood looking after them with a strong desire tugging at his heart to yield his pride and go along too. He made one final struggle with his pride and then darted after his comrades, yelling, "Wait, wait! I want to tell you something." They presently stopped and turned around. When he got to where they were, he began to unfold his secret, and they listened moodily till at last they saw the point he was driving at. And then they set up a war whoop of applause and said it was splendid, and said if he had told them at first, they wouldn't have started away. But there was no hilarity in the little town. The Harpers and Aunt Polly were being put into mourning with great grief and many tears. Becky Thatcher found herself moping about and feeling very melancholy. When the Sunday school hour was finished the next morning, the bell began to toll instead of ringing in the usual way. The villagers began to gather, loitering a moment in the church vestibule to converse in whispers about the sad event. As the clergyman drew such pictures of the graces, the winning ways, and the rare promise of the lost lads that every soul there, thinking he recognized these pictures, felt a pang in remembering that he had persistently blinded himself to them always before, and had as persistently seen only faults and flaws in the poor boys. The congregation became more and more moved as the pathetic tale went on, till at last the whole company broke down and joined the weeping mourners in a chorus of anguished sobs, the priest feelings and crying in the pulpit. There was a rustle in the gallery which nobody noticed. A moment later the church door creaked. The minister raised his streaming eyes above his handkerchief and stood transfixed. Followed the ministers, and then all the congregation rose and stared while the aisle, Tom in the lead, Huck, a ruin of drooping rags. They had been hid in the to their own funeral sermon. Aunt Polly and the ones smothered them with kisses. Huck stood abashed and uncomfortable, or where to hide from so many unwelcoming eyes. He wavered, teased him and said, "Aunt Polly," and so they shouted. Poor motherless thing. And the loving attentions Aunt Polly lavished upon Huck were the one thing capable of making him more uncomfortable than he was before. Tom, according to Aunt Polly's various moods, and he hardly knew which expressed an affection for himself. That was Tom's great secret. Pirates and attend their own funerals. Shore on a log at dusk on Saturday, till nearly daylight, and then crept through the back lanes and alleys and finished among the chaos of abandoned benches. Hero Tom was become now, but moved with a dignified